Last time, we made a pretty airtight case for focusing on what you can control. Epictetus told us that attaching our peace of mind to things outside of our power is a category error that produces only suffering. And Aristotle said that moral virtue is built through action inside real, concrete, close-range life that we actually inhabit. And Viktor Frankl, who tested all of this inside of a Nazi death camp, told us that the last irreducible human freedom is the freedom to choose your own response to circumstances that you did not choose and cannot change. It's a pretty compelling framework, but it is certainly not the only framework. So today we are going to sit with a little bit of discomfort, because the philosophers on this side of the argument are not so easy to dismiss, and anyone who takes ideas seriously enough to build a philosophy of life owes it to themselves to hear the hardest version of the case against them. Hannah Arendt was a German Jewish philosopher who fled the Nazi regime in 1933 and spent years as a stateless person. And eventually, she became one of the most important political thinkers of the 20th century. Her most famous work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, was an attempt to answer a question that haunted an entire generation. How does something like the Holocaust actually happen? Not in abstract terms or in terms of ideology or even economics, but in terms of the specific human behavior that allows it to function at the scale that it did. And her answer was not what most people expect. She did not locate the machinery of atrocity primarily in the cruelty of extraordinary people, but instead in the ordinariness of everyone else, in the widespread, culturally reinforced habit of treating political life as someone else's department and private life as the only arena that actually mattered. Arendt called this the collapse of the vita activa, or the active life, and the life of public participation and political engagement. And she argued that this collapse did not just fail to prevent totalitarianism, but it created the conditions under which totalitarianism becomes possible in the first place. Her concept of the public realm is central here. For Arendt, human beings are not fully realized as persons in private, in the home, family, in the individual interior life that Epictetus and Frankl prize so highly. But instead, we become fully human through the action in the shared world and through the practice of showing up in public space to speak, debate, disagree, and collectively determine the direction of communal life. When people abandon that space, and they decide that the political world is too corrupt or too complex or too far beyond their individual power to deal with, they don't just opt out of this civic responsibility, but instead they hand over the public realm to whoever wants it badly enough to stay. And the problem is that there are a lot of bad actors in the world, and so she would challenge people to ask a different question. What do you think happens when a few bad people are allowed to scale? And her answer is that everything is essentially built incrementally by aggravated decisions of millions of ordinary people in dozens of countries to tend to their gardens and mind their own business and trust that someone else is watching the public sphere. The private life is not a neutral retreat. In Ardent's framework, it is a political act. Specifically, it is the act of ceding the field. And this is what she meant by the banality of evil. She wasn't saying that evil is boring, but she was saying that it does not require exceptional malice. It requires only the suspension of thinking, the willingness to execute a role within a system without ever asking what the system is for. And that suspicion is far easier to achieve in a population that has already decided the public world isn't their problem. Now, Jean-Paul Sartre would come at this from a different angle, but arrive at a similarly uncomfortable place. His contribution to this conversation is the concept of bad faith, which is the specific form of self-deception involved in pretending that you have less freedom than you actually do. Sartre's existentialism begins with the radical claim that human beings are condemned to be free, that there is no human nature or fixed essence, and no God-given role that determines what we must be or do, which means that every choice is genuinely a choice, including the choice to act as if you have no choices. When you say, I can't refuse to pay my taxes, or I can't make demands without leverage, or even that I cannot change what's happening, Sartre would slow down at the word can't and ask you to be a little more honest. Because you can, and the consequences might be severe, and the probability of success might be pretty small. But the statement, I cannot, is almost never entirely true. What we really mean to say is I have decided not to, and I am framing that decision as an inevitability so I don't have to fully own it. But bad faith is not necessarily stupidity or cowardice, just a very human way of managing the weight of freedom, which is genuinely heavy. But Sartre insists that running from this weight does not make it disappear. If you have a choice and you make it, the outcome of that choice is partly yours, whether you acknowledge it or not. The person who could have organized and voted differently or donated or could have made noise and chose instead to focus inwardly because the outer world felt too large, well, that person is not innocent of the outer world. They are complicit through their chosen absence. And of all the philosophers in this conversation, Peter Singer is probably the one who is going to speak the loudest. His argument is not very complicated, which is exactly what makes it so difficult to escape. Imagine you are walking to work and you pass a shallow pond, and there's a small child drowning in it. Now, you could easily wade in and save that child, but it would ruin your shoes and make you late. But the cost is trivial relative to human life, and no reasonable person would argue that you have the right to keep walking. But right now, there are children dying in conflict zones, famine conditions, and circumstances that could be altered by collective political pressure, by aid, or the specific kind of sustained civic attention that moves governments to act differently. The only meaningful difference between the drowning child in front of you and the child dying on the other side of the world is distance. And Singer's question is whether distance is a morally relevant variable. But his argument is that it is not. Not because distant suffering is identical to proximate suffering in every psychological sense, but because the child's death is not more permissible or acceptable, or less of a moral event simply because you cannot see it. And if distance cannot control the weight of the situation, then those who believe that they can only control what's close to them is a framework of philosophy that is not well-placed energy. It's a philosophy of well-rationalized convenience. And Singer would not accuse you of being a bad person, but instead to just simply ask that you be honest about what you're arguing, which is not that I focus on where I can have impact, but I have decided the impact I would need to have is too costly and inconvenient, so I'm going to look away. Now, that is a choice that you're allowed to make, because we're all human, but it's not a choice that comes without the moral weight. Frankl's freedom of response does not have to mean the response is always inward, because you can choose your response and make it one that reaches outward and one that participates and refuses the comfortable narrowness of a life that only ever asks of you what you feel equipped to give. So, while we should focus on what we can control, we also should understand that we have control over a lot more than we give ourselves credit for. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see y'all next time.